I'm really honoured to be asked to speak here today, and I want to thank the institution for the invitation. What I want to talk about today is really to sort of follow on from Clark's introduction and to talk about energy access and why energy access is so important for human development and for well-being. But also, and I also want to talk about some of the challenges that we're faced in trying to actually achieve universal access to energy services in the first place. And then I want to finish off by making two. Is this not high enough?
Yeah, I think so. Just to get you.
Is that better? I want to finish off by, if you like, making two arguments. One, that this access to energy, or the lack of access to energy in the world at the moment, is not just a minor technical issue that needs resolving. A few barriers need removing in order to reach out to a small part of the world's population that lacks access. This is a matter of justice. And then the second argument I want to make right at the end is that looking at off-grid electricity as part of the solution to this problem is often looked at from the perspective of a stopgap, of something that you have to do to make good where the grid can't reach. And I think when we're doing that, when we say that, we're actually looking at the wrong end of the telescope, and we're ignoring a really interesting opportunity for an alternative development path. So I want to talk a little bit about that as well right at the end. But let's start with energy access and why that's important to development. Energy access, access to energy services enables. You've seen this diagram before, but we need energy in the home, modern energy services in the home, to fight this burden to start with, the actual sort of physical burden of the collection of fuel for cooking, and to fight the problem of burning open fires for cooking in the house and the damage that does to health. I'm actually not going to talk that much about cooking in this presentation today. It could take a complete presentation on its own. I'm going to focus more on electricity, but this is obviously, as the major energy requirement in households, it's obviously a particular issue itself. But we need access to modern energy services in the home to provide lighting, to provide space heating where it's cold, or cooling where it's hot, rather innovative air conditioner there, to provide communications, and to do things like prolong the life of food and to reduce wastage there. And then finally, we need the access to mechanical energy within the household itself to deal with some of the sort of really backbreaking chores and work that are required, in this case, milling maize in Zambia by hand. But it's not just energy in the home that's important. We need energy in the workplace to power livelihoods. The provision of energy services itself can be a livelihood, as is shown here. These are ladies called barefoot solar technicians that are actually being trained in India to assemble and also to repair solar appliances for a livelihood. These are solar sisters based in Tanzania, make a living out of selling solar appliances to villages and communities there. This is a guy in Kenya who makes a living out of charging batteries to provide electricity services to those that are not connected to the grid. So you can make a livelihood out of the provision of energy services in the first place, but perhaps what's more important is that we need access to energy services to power livelihoods, to power agriculture, in this case sprinkler for irrigation, heat, process heat, in this case for small enterprises that these ladies in Darfur and Sudan are running to process food, or SMEs, a small barber shop, a cold store, and an internet access point in a village in Peru. And then in addition to access to modern energy services for the home and for work, we need energy in the community for community services. Whether that is pumping water to try and compensate for that sort of massive effort and work that's involved in collecting water in places like Nepal, or it's bringing health services closer to communities, whether that's just sort of the simple powering of a health post in terms of light, water, sterilization equipment, or the actual provision of specific healthcare equipment, whether that's a vaccine refrigerator to extend the cold chain for vaccines, or maternity equipment, suction apparatus, incubators to be able to support difficult births. And we need energy access in schools, lighting, space heating, cooking facilities for school meals, but also, again, specialist equipment, ICTs to enhance educational experience, or tools for vocational training. And we need energy for security in its simplest form, street lighting. And it's these three services together, as Clark said, it's these energy services in the home, in work, and in the community that we can think of as total energy access, and probably what we should be shooting for. And we'll come back to that again in a minute. So delivering that, delivering that through affordable grid access would be great, but it's not going to happen. At least it's not going to happen for a big chunk of the 15% of the world's population that doesn't have access to electricity at the moment. And it's not going to happen for a couple of reasons. One is just sheer finance. The IEA back in 2011 estimated that it's going to cost something of the order of $44.5 billion a year for electricity, and another, I think it's $4.5 billion a year for clean cooking to achieve universal access by 2030. And the latest WEO Energy Access Supplement hasn't really changed those figures that much. Back in 2013, it calculated how much money was going into those at the moment, and it's a fraction of what's required. And again, the latest version of the WEO has not really changed those numbers substantially. So we've obviously got to do two things here to start with. We've got to find a way of getting more finance into the energy access sector to bridge that gap. But we've also got to find a cheaper, more cost-effective way of delivering services in the process. I think there are two things we have to do here together. Clark showed this diagram already. The main point here is to say, if we don't do that, at the moment we're on course for getting to 91% access as far as electricity is concerned, and only 72% access as far as clean cooking is concerned by 2030. So we've got a gap to address. And I guess one of the other things to sort of flag around here as well is that gap differs from region to region. And there's a particular concern in sub-Saharan Africa around access to electricity. All the other three regions, we're seeing a gradual decline in absolute and relative terms in terms of the number of people that lack access to electricity year on year. But in sub-Saharan Africa, those numbers are continuing to climb, and that's a real concern. It means effectively that population growth is outstripping the rate at which we're able to supply new services. And I guess the other thing to say here is that the energy deficit, this 15% of the world's population at the moment that lacks access, is predominantly rural, with some caveats, and I'll come back to that again in a minute, but that's one of the other diagrams that Clark was talking to at the moment. But we can say for now that it's predominantly a rural population, and that has implications for grid extension because rural populations are relatively sparsely, they're not dense, they're well spread out, they're often remote. It becomes extremely expensive to pull grids and transmission lines and distribution lines out to service them. So the latest version of the World Energy Outlook's Energy Access Outlook, which was published in 2017, tries to address this and say, well, what is it we need to do, given that this is a predominantly rural problem and there are issues around pulling the grid out. And it looks at this in two steps. The first step is what it calls the new policy scenario, and that's really, if you take a look across the world today, and particularly the sort of 55 developing countries in the world that still have a significant energy access deficit, and you look at existing plans, policies, and strategies projecting through to the future, where will we be? And according to those plans and policies that exist at the moment, 50% roughly of the population that's going to get access to electricity under those plans between now and 2030 is going to be served off-grid. That's either mini-grids or standalone systems. So only 50% is going to be served by the grid anyway. And that's going to eat up something like 63% of the investment that's going to be made in energy access between now and 2030. But there's a problem there, as we've seen already, and that is that doesn't deliver universal access. That delivers something that's around 8% short of that. So there'll still be 684 million people without access to electricity in 2030 under those plans. So then the IEA goes one more step and says, well, okay, to deal with that 684 million people, what are we going to need to do? And here we see that for them, an even greater percentage is going to have to be served off-grid. So 70% of that population is going to be served off-grid, taking just about 71% of that remainder of the investment. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is, we're establishing that the 15% of the world now that doesn't have access to electricity is substantially rural, and it is going to be served substantially by off-grid solutions. And that's, that's coming from the IEA. That's not a sort of pie in the sky thing. This is the least cost, most likely way in which we're going to achieve universal access. So we take that as a given, I think. So given that, I just want to sort of step back a little bit maybe and start to think again about, well, what does energy access really mean? Because we've got this global target, this UN SDG 7, which says universal access to modern energy services by 2030. But there's no definition of what that means. And if we go onto this sort of idea that Clark's been talking about, are we talking about energy supply or electricity supply, or are we talking about energy services when we're talking about universal access? What are we talking about? If you look at the sort of global statistics that are available, and probably the most comprehensive set is the Global Tracking Framework, which is published every 2 years by UN SE4ALL. Those statistics come from household surveys or national census primarily, not from utility data, because utility data doesn't actually cover entire populations. It only covers those that are attached to the grid, obviously. And the question that's asked is this sort of binary question. Are you connected to an electricity supply, or does your house have electricity, yes or no? And as Clark sort of showed, that's not really a useful question, because what we want to know is, do you have access to these energy services? That's the big question, not are you connected to an electricity supply or not. I can be connected to a grid connection and have electricity for only 2 hours a day or 2 hours a week, so I can't do these energy services. I can be connected to a grid and have 24-hour-a-day supply, but it's so expensive that I can only use it for lighting, so I don't have these energy services. So that binary question is the wrong question to ask. It's, do you have access to energy services? That is the critical issue. Again, you can see that Clark and I are really well aligned, because even some of our slides are identical. I was going, oh, Clark, not another one every time. For some of you that maybe are not familiar with this, there is a framework, if you like, for looking at household electricity, cooking, electricity for community services, and electricity for productive use. So this is just the one for domestic electricity. And really, it's just a sort of set of 7 attributes that include the sort of capacity in terms of watts and watt hours of the particular supply, the duration, not just the number of hours a day, but also the number of hours that are available, electricity is available during the evening, which is obviously a critical time for household electricity. And then affordability, reliability, legality of supply. Is this just people sort of hooking wires over transmission lines in urban slums, or is it a legal supply? Health and safety, and then quality in terms of the quality of the voltage. Is there extreme voltage fluctuations? Does that have an impact on the sort of equipment you can run? And then 6 tiers, running from 0, which is no electricity, through to tier 5, which is pretty much 24-hour grid equivalent, where you can run high power appliances. So this then starts to allow you to tease out differences in supplies. So Clark's already gone through this one. Again, all I'll say here is this is where my reservation around some of the urban access statistics remains. So although we're saying 90-odd% of the world's population that lacks access to electricity at the moment is rural, there is a real question over the urban populations as well as to exactly what quality of energy is available. But sticking for the moment with sort of rural populations, what the tier system helps us to look at is the sort of types of services you can get at different levels of electricity supply. So at tier 1, really, you're talking about just task lighting, so effectively a lamp that you can carry around with you to do specific tasks, a rebuy and so on. At tier 2, you're beginning to look at multi-point lighting, which means you might have lights in each room. You may be able to charge a phone. You may have a small, low wattage appliance like a fan, maybe even a small TV. Tier 3, you're beginning to get higher sort of power appliances, such as a rice cooker maybe, or a water pump, very small water pump. Tier 4, an iron, a hairdryer, those sorts of things. And only when you get to tier 5 does the potential for cooking from electricity actually emerge, even if you can afford it in terms of the amount of electricity that's available. So you can see these through these different sort of tiers, you get a sense of what might be possible. And you can relate the tiers also to the sort of technologies that might supply them. So, tier 1 is probably going to be a standalone solar lantern or something equivalent. Tier 5 could be delivered by the grid, or it could be delivered by a mini grid. And in between, you've got sort of technologies including petrol or diesel generators or solar home systems and the like. With that in mind, coming back to this question again, what is it that's our level of ambition in terms of supplying universal energy, modern energy service to everybody? What is it we're really shooting for? If it's tier 1, what are the pluses and minuses for users? What are the pluses and minuses for policymakers in respect of that? Well, for tier 1, yeah, great. We've got task lighting where there was none before. Maybe phone charging with some of these lanterns. Certainly some health benefits. The burning of kerosene itself is the sort of principal fuel for lighting, has significant health implications in households, so maybe some health benefits as well. But the big thing here is cash purchase. These are reasonably cheap. The prices of these have been plummeting in recent years. And you can generally sort of rationalise a purchase in a household of a solar lantern on the basis of maybe 2 or 3 months of savings in kerosene expenditures. So this becomes possible for a relatively poor household to purchase, but no broader energy services. From a policymaker's perspective, I guess the big thing is this is a market-based solution. It doesn't require massive subsidies, so it has the potential for scalability with limited inputs. There are claims that access to good lighting, like solar lamps, actually has an impact on education. The literature doesn't support that, really. There is some literature which shows a shifting of hours of study from daylight to evening, but when you start looking at the impact that that's had on test results, scores, and the like, it's very difficult to show that that's actually having an impact at all. There's also an argument made by policymakers that the solar lantern is the first step on an energy ladder, which will take people further up into better services, but the first rung and the second rung of the energy ladder are a pretty big gap in between, and so I don't really buy that. People that have got the money are going into the second tier pretty much straight away. And from a policymaker, even from a policymaker's perspective, the idea that you can't provide these broader energy services is a real issue. So if we start moving on to solar home systems, which can be anywhere from the top end of tier 1 up until tier 3, really, there are significant pluses here for users' perspectives. PAYG, pay-as-you-go financing, has made these smaller systems really affordable, and you've seen markets take off in Bangladesh previously and now in East Africa. A PAYG approach allows you to maybe pay on very small daily or weekly payments, often by mobile money or a scratch card methodology, and pay a sort of $200 system off over 12 to 18 months. So they become affordable. And they do provide a range of services. You get multi-point lighting, so you can light your whole house. You can have a lamp in each room. You can charge things like phones. You might be able to run low power appliances like fans and maybe TVs off them. You'd be able to do even more if there were more super efficient appliances available on the market, and that's a really sort of interesting area for development for us, I think. But if you want mechanical power, then the affordability becomes a real issue, because you have to look at the much larger sizes of solar home systems beyond the affordability of most of the sort of population we're looking at. So this example is in Peru, the picture in the bottom left, and the lady that owned that particular system was able to run a sort of spinner to spin yarn from her alpaca wool, but a load above that is pretty much impossible. That's the top end of a mechanical load on those small solar home systems. From a policymaker's perspective, again, it's a market-based approach, so it has scalability, and people have got very excited in East Africa around pay-as-you-go approaches and the potential for that to really deliver at scale. But there are some real questions around pay-as-you-go financing, and I'll come back to that in a second. And again, if you want mechanical power for livelihoods, this is not going to deliver it. So there's still that question about what is it we're aiming for, what are we shooting for? And then I guess the next step up from that is mini-grids, really, and they're sort of moving to tiers 4 and tier 5 in terms of supplies. From the user's perspective, all domestic uses, including medium and high power appliances, are there and possible, and mechanical power is possible. like this maize mill, for example, in Mozambique. The downside, again, is going to be affordability, and the questions come in here from the policymaker side are sort of two big questions. One is, what are the management systems you put in place to make these things work, to keep them affordable and to make sure they're sustainable? And secondly, how do you make them affordable? Because they generally require some sort of capital subsidy in there somewhere to make them affordable. And just to look at those financing issues in a little bit more detail, if we assume from the moment that sort of standalone solar lanterns are not what we're shooting for, that the sort of minimum level is maybe a solar home system, or if we're really lucky, maybe a sort of mini-grid system. If we assume that, what's the issues with pay-as-you-go and solar home systems? Well, the market for solar goods per se in the developing world has grown significantly over the last few years, since really 2010. This graph on the top here shows sales in numbers of units. It includes standalone solar lamps, so it's everything. Since 2010, half-yearly sales. So you can see it's really sort of rocketed up, although it's tailed off a bit over the last 18 months. It's quite difficult to be able to separate out from those figures for solar home systems as opposed to solar lanterns, but there is some numbers for the last sort of 1.5 years. And there you can, one of the things you notice there immediately is that this activity, this market is very different in different places. These are 3 regions in Africa. In Southern Africa, there's virtually no market for solar home systems at the moment. The sales numbers are really small. In West Africa, you've got a rapidly emerging market. It's grown by about 150% in the last 18 months or so, but from a very low base. In East Africa, which is the most mature market, you're seeing a decline in sales in the last year and a half. There are a number of reasons behind that, but one of them is probably pay-as-you-go finance, and it's worth sort of understanding this a little, because it's been put up as such a sort of panacea for delivering energy services, and it's running up against a real brick wall to an extent at the moment, despite attracting quite a lot of private equity. Best way to look at this is maybe to just compare 2 companies. If you think about a company that manufactures and distributes white goods like refrigerators and so on, and you think about a company that manufactures and distributes a pay-as-you-go solar system, and just think about them in terms of they're the same size, they have the same credit ratings from bank, so equal financial standing. The white goods company will grow faster than the solar home system company, always. And there's a sort of fundamental reason for that. The white goods factory is targeting a consumer base that is probably banked and has a credit history. The solar home systems is targeting a consumer base that's not banked, and doesn't have a credit history, and is poor. When a white goods manufacturer supplies to a retailer a fridge, he gets cash payment for it, and so the credit he's used to manufacture that fridge comes back immediately, and he can manufacture another fridge. When the solar home systems manufacturer and supplier provides a solar home system, he has to wait 18 months to get the money back, because he has to supply the retail credit. There is a failure of the retail credit market for this group of people. So the manufacturer and supplier themselves has to supply the credit, which means that it takes longer to recover the money to be able to manufacture the next system. So in effect, the white goods people have the normal financial risks of equipment manufacturers and suppliers, but the retail credit risks are layered on to solar home systems manufacturers and suppliers. And that means in turn that the white goods people are seen to be lower risk by the bank. They get lower collateral requirements, the opposite for the solar home systems, and as a result, one grows faster than the other. And this is a real issue, and it's something that solar home system suppliers are hitting at the moment, and it's at least one of the attributes to that slowdown in sales that I showed earlier. So that's something that needs to be tackled, and there are a number of suggestions around how that could be done, which includes sort of national credit insurance schemes to reduce risks for banks and help them to sort of bring together individual companies as portfolios to loan to. But it's an issue, and it's an issue that needs still to be resolved. If we move on to mini-grids, there's a different issue here. I mean, here the whole, from my perspective, the whole point of pushing mini-grids is this opportunity to go beyond lighting and low power appliances, and ideally to move up as far as mechanical power if you need it. This opportunity for actually utilising energy for economic purposes. This graph represents, it's something that was put together by the Lawrence Berkeley Institute, California, and it tries to represent a sort of set of electricity items, appliances, that might be useful to a typical rural household. So on the left-hand side of the diagram, you've got the sort of normal things that a solar home system would provide in terms of maybe a small fan, LED lights, maybe a small TV. But then you move up the power requirements to maybe a small refrigerator, maybe a small water pump, and you've got the sort of number of hours that each one of these might be used per day by a household. And you can see that immediately you step away from those low power things, the power requirements get bigger very quickly. The estimate here is maybe something of the order of 80 watt hours per month would be a reasonable sort of supply for a poor rural household if it wanted to do more than just light its home, but actually use energy for economic purposes as well. If you then start to look at the costs of delivering that through a mini grid, in this case the prices have been done for a solar powered mini grid, and I think the costs come out at roughly sort of 24 cents per kilowatt hour. That's to recover the entire capital cost of the investment and operation costs. And you compare that to the typical budgets that different classes of poverty within that sort of 4 billion of global poor people population in the world are actually spending on energy at the moment. You can see there's a very significant gap between what it would cost to deliver those services and what people can actually afford in terms of budgets. So again, we've got an issue here. How do you bridge that gap? If you want to go beyond just lighting and low power appliances, how do you finance and organise mini grids? And there are two sort of really big questions here, which I've hinted to before. One is around the management structures that help you do that, and there are a whole sort of plethora of different approaches to trying to manage mini grids to be most efficient and effective and sustainable, and they range from sort of municipal ownership and management in Peru and in Bolivia through to private models that are being tried at the moment in Sierra Leone with UN and DFID, through to sort of mixed models where you have the community owning the fixed infrastructure, so the transmission lines and maybe the shed in which the sort of power infrastructure is housed, but a private company being brought in under contract for a particular point in time to bring the solar panels or the pump, in other words, the turbine, the movable equipment, and to deliver energy services. But whatever you do, there tend to be two sort of financial issues that have to be addressed. One is a capital subsidy. None of these examples that I've got here have been able to be constructed without a capital subsidy. So this is not a market-driven solution in the pure sense. And secondly, from a sustainability perspective, they all need an anchor client. They need a productive use that's actually going to, in effect, cross-subsidise or make up for the fact that consumers are probably not going to use that much, at least in the early years. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of micro-hydro projects around the world at the moment that are really struggling because they don't have that anchor client and they cannot generate enough, they don't use enough power and therefore they don't generate enough income to actually cover their own costs. So that's a real issue here. Just a sort of final note around delivery of public services. So, whether that's a water supply or in this case a vaccine fridge in a clinic in Sierra Leone, these may be the anchor clients that mini grids need, provided the government can afford to pay its energy bills. But quite often they're actually delivered as standalone systems. In both of these cases, they were delivered as standalone systems. You do see on occasion those institutions, whether it's a school or a community, then selling power on, maybe through battery charging systems, whatever, to try and cover some of the operation and maintenance costs. But usually there's a substantial, again, capital subsidy that's required to deliver public services of this nature. And I think it's really important to recognise that, because for all the rhetoric around market-driven solutions to some of these problems, there are very few examples in the world where that's actually happening. Most of the public services like this are delivered through some sort of capital subsidy. So just to finish, I guess, on this bit, finance isn't the only challenge that we face. We're trying to create an ecosystem which involves a number of actors, from the household to suppliers to communities to market chains to policymakers and supporting services, and an ecosystem of capacity of policy and finance whose natural outcome is universal access to energy. We're trying to create this system at the moment. So finance is one issue, but policy and capacity is another. And that capacity can be technical capacity, the understanding of how to design, operate and maintain renewable energy off-grid systems. This is a training institute in Peru that provides that sort of training for Latin America. Or it could be helping financial institutions to understand issues around quality assurance with solar products so that they know what to loan for and what not to loan for. So capacity in many different senses. And then the other area is around sort of whole policy environment that is or is not supportive of off-grid investments. Probably the most comprehensive review of that. There are a number of studies that look at this, but perhaps the most comprehensive is the regulatory indicators for sustainable energy that was developed by SBAP and the World Bank, and it should be published every 2 years now on. That looks at the 3 pillars of SE4ALL, so it also looks at renewable energy and energy efficiency. But the energy access pillar has, I think it's 8 sort of policy areas which this index drills down into, and under each of those policy areas there is a set of sub-questions. So the policy area around does the country have a viable energy plan and strategy, has a whole bunch of other questions underneath it, including, for example, does the plan include provision for off-grid services? Likewise, there's an area of sort of policy investigation which is around framework for standalone systems, and particularly there, a whole bunch of questions around quality standards that are being adopted, because one of the issues with standalone systems has been the flooding of markets, particularly in East Africa, with cheap Chinese solar goods that work for a few weeks and then break, and that spoils the market. It reduces people's faith in that particular technology, and so you get market spoilers through that. So quality assurance, particularly important. And it is possible using this RISE index, which looks at all these factors and then gives them a score and a traffic light system at the end. It is possible to show that there are very different policy regimes in different countries that are either supportive of off-grid or supportive of energy access more broadly, or not supportive of it. And this is the top 10 and bottom 10 scoring countries out of the 55 that RISE looks at to see that there is that difference. And there is a sense that there is some degree of relationship between a score for a good policy environment under RISE and the sort of levels of energy access that you can see in countries. I mean, it's a fairly big spread there, but there is a sort of general trend to suggest that this may well be important. So, just to sort of summarize what I've been trying to say today so far, access to energy is fundamental to the achievement of a sort of basic foundation. It's essential to the improvement of the quality of life, but it's also critical to power livelihoods, and it's critical to deliver basic community services. So it's a critical enabler. A significant proportion of those people that live without electricity today are rural, and they're going to only get access to it through off-grid services. There's a sort of growing focus on solar home systems as the route to electricity services, but there are a couple of issues there. One is that raises the question about levels of ambition. If solar home systems is what we're trying to deliver, what about mechanical power? What about power for livelihoods? And then beyond that, there are some restrictions that are actually faced by the financing that's being used for that. This pay-as-you-go financing, which is seen to be a sort of panacea, but in fact has its own really inherent problems that needs to be addressed. The mini-grids have this potential to provide energy services at the highest tiers, but there are real issues around how you pay for those, and we have to face up to them rather than continually sort of stick our head in the sand and pretend they don't exist. But finance isn't the only issue. We've also got issues around the sort of policy environment, regulatory environment, and about capacity that we also need to address. And I said that I was going to sort of try and make two other arguments at the end, and I'll make these really briefly. But one is, we come to off-grid services as the method by which we will plug the hole that the grid can't achieve. And if you think about it, that it doesn't always really make that much sense. I mean, it's like saying we'll only use mobile phones where the sort of fixed telephony infrastructure doesn't reach. That's not what happened. The reverse happened. Mobile phones came in, and suddenly it became possible to not have to make that investment in fixed infrastructure and to leapfrog a whole technology. And I just don't feel that we're really looking at this through the right end of the telescope. There's a real opportunity here to try and do something different. For a start, if you're providing a solar home system or a community-managed mini-grid, you are actually devolving the ownership of the means of production, if you want to put it in those words. You're creating a dispersed ownership of power infrastructure instead of concentrating it in one place. That must be a benefit to start with, but you've also got benefits in terms of the flexibility of that system then, and its ability to have resilience in the case of disaster, and the idea that you might actually, if you want a grid, you might be able to think about building a grid from the bottom up rather than necessarily from the top down. With other technologies that are coming into place now that are also encouraging that sort of sense of a distributed ownership of resources. We've got the internet. So small enterprises now have the ability to connect with markets that companies with massive advertising budgets could only dream of in the past. So we have things there. We have new technologies coming in, like 3D printing, which can quite easily be run off of an independent solar power system, and which are already being used in some places in Africa to do everything from manufacturing artificial limbs to manufacturing bits or whole water pumps, as these two examples give. So I think we need to rethink that. That's one plea. We need to rethink what it is we're trying to do. There is an opportunity here for something much bigger than supplying energy, if only we looked through the right end of the telescope. And then my second argument is that this is not just an issue around trying to remove a few awkward barriers to serve a difficult community, and it's a sort of technical issue. This is an issue of justice. The incandescent light bulb was first patented by Edison in 1879. So how is it 150 odd years later that there's still 1 billion people in the world without access to something which is absolutely fundamental to establishing a sort of basic social foundation and standard of living? And it's not just a sort of unfortunate consequence of a sort of technical process. There are choices that are being made here, and that's why it's an injustice. So, as I said earlier, the IEA estimates that something in the order of between 60 and 70% of all investment between now and 2030 on energy access has to be made in off-grid systems if we're going to hit that target. But one of the realities is nobody measures that. We'll have no idea what proportion of investment globally is going into off-grid versus on-grid. It's not in any, the UN SE4ALL Global Tracking Framework doesn't track it. The IEA doesn't track it. Sierra Club tried to look at the investment portfolios of the development banks a few years ago now, so this data is out of date. And it may have improved slightly, but it tells a story. The best performers, the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank, were putting 25% of their loan portfolio in energy access into off-grid. The African Development Bank at the time was putting none. These are choices. And they're choices between effectively putting more money and investment in to put electricity into a system to provide more electricity to people that already have it, by and large, versus providing energy to people who don't have it for the first time. This is a choice, and therefore making the wrong choice is a conscious thing, and it's an injustice. So that's it, really. I think we've got, my two final comments are that this is not an unfortunate consequence of the way technology rolls out. It's a choice. Therefore, we're looking at an issue of technology justice. And that if we get this right, this is not just about providing energy access to the 15% of the world who don't have it at the moment. It's about thinking of a different way, a new path for development that allows for a distributed ownership of much of the means of production. And it's something that actually really puts meaning to the word power to the people. Thank you very much.